The history of cell theory. We start in 1595 with a man named Zachariah Janssen. Dutch-born spectacle maker Zachariah Janssen created something rather amazing. Not only did he create that amazing twirly mustache you see, but he also invented the first compound microscope. This is how we end up in 1665 meeting a man named Robert Hooke. Hooke used his homemade microscope to examine a slide of cork and became the first man to discover plant cells. Hooke described what he saw in a paper he wrote called Micrographia. In the paper he called them cells because they reminded him of the rooms monks slept in monasteries, also called cells. The cell walls observed by Hooke were the remnant cell walls of dead plant cells. The first man to see a living cell was Anton van Leeuwenhoek, 5 years later in 1670. After reading Robert Hooke's paper Micrographia, Leeuwenhoek was inspired to undertake some serious research. Eventually he created a microscope that looked like a small paddle and was capable of magnifying around 270 times, when most microscopes of that era were only capable of magnifying 50 times. In 1674, Leeuwenhoek used his microscope to observe living algae cells, and 9 years later in 1683 observed bacteria, calling them animalcules. Not much happened with cells for well over 100 years until 1830, when we meet a Scottish botanist with wicked sideburns named Robert Brown. When Brown was just 28, he sailed to Australia, where he collected over 500 plant species in 3 weeks. While studying these plants, Brown was the first man to observe the nucleus of a cell, and published his findings 3 years later in 1833. We then jump forward 5 years to 1838, where we meet a German botanist named Matthias Schleiden. After numerous years examining plant species under a microscope while stroking his glorious mustache, he realized all the plants he had studied were made of cells. At the same time, on the other side of Germany, Theodor Schwann was studying animal cells under microscopes. After studying animal cells for some time, he realized that all animals were made of cells. Upon discovering this, he reached out to other scientists about his discovery, and eventually it was Matthias Schleiden who got back to him, and the two began working on cell theory. Both scientists came up with and agreed on the first two statements of cell theory. However, they disagreed on the third point. Schleiden thought all cells had to come from other cells, but Schwann thought cells came from spontaneous generation. Cell theory was formally published in 1839 by Schwann, which included his incorrect third point and without acknowledging anybody else's contribution. This caused the two scientists to have beef with one another. No, not that type of beef, this type of beef. Schwann's incorrect third point wasn't corrected until 19 years later by a beautifully bearded German physician named Rudolf Virchow. In 1858, Virchow corrected Schwann's theory by releasing a paper which said all cells come from pre-existing cells, and the cell theory we know today was born.